It's a bit better. There we go. Okay, you can go for it.
Oops. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very auspicious occasion. I will be introducing myself later. I'm the program director, Professor Melanie Lacay, and I just want to give you a heads up. We are going to start strictly in 2 minutes at about 5 o'clock. When the procession comes in, could you please stand for the procession? We will give you a signal when the procession will come in. And then would you continue standing for our first item, which is the national anthem? So we still do have a little bit of time, but we will give you a signal when the procession comes in. And please do rise for the procession. Thank you. Can we all please find our seats? And we will rise for the procession. Thank you. have the national anthem by the Creative Arts Choir. Thank you. Thank you very much. You may be seated. And thank you to the choir. So good evening all, and welcome to a rather chilly Cape Town today, but we have a very warm occasion, the inaugural lecture of Professor Rouaan Maarman. I am Professor Melanie Lacay, the Deputy Dean of Learning and Teaching in the Faculty of Education, and I feel very privileged to be the Program Director today for the inaugural lecture of our colleague, Prof. Maarman, who's been in the Faculty of Education for many years. As we celebrate this momentous achievement for Prof. Maarman, we look forward to getting to know Prof. Maarman in his academic journey, as is evident in our program, as you can see above. But before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge our esteemed colleagues with us today who were part of the procession. First, our VC, Prof. Robert Balfour, our DVC academic, Prof. Monwabisi Khalakhala, our DVC Research and Innovation, Prof. Jose France, our registrar, Dr. Anita Lawson-Misra, Dr. Ahmed Sheikji, our deputy registrar, and our dean from the Faculty of Education, Professor Rajendran Govender. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of our deans, deputy deans, HODs, and also those who helped organize the administrators and support staff. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Prof. Maarman's family and friends who are in the front. And Prof. Maarman, I had a conversation with him this morning, and he told me, please don't forget to acknowledge our students, our postgraduate and undergraduate students who played a big part in shaping the academic career of Prof. Maarman. I'd also like to acknowledge, I think there is an online presence. So to those colleagues that are perhaps not in Cape Town, welcome to you. And like I said previously, it's quite a chilly Cape Town. So as part of the program, the second part of the program, I'd like to invite Prof. Robert Balfour, the Rector and Vice-chancellor, to do the welcome.
Thank you very much, Prof. Lakai. Colleagues, what a thrilling occasion to be together tonight. We haven't, as I understand it, had inaugural lectures for quite a long time in person. And so it's really a pleasure to be able to commence again with this program in light of the importance and significance of this occasion to not only the academic we are celebrating this evening, but of course to the whole academic community, inclusive of our students and indeed our staff, and also the family and the friends who are gathered here. So it's a great pleasure for me also to welcome you to UWC, as this is my first inaugural lecture as well, Prof. Maarman, although it is tonight we are celebrating you in your special capacity. My heartfelt thanks also go to the deans here this evening. Thank you for being here, or the deans' representatives and deputy deans present. I want especially to acknowledge the leader of our academic community in this area, Prof. Raj Govardhan, the dean, and thank him also and the entire community of scholars that has made this evening possible. I think we all understand that the journey towards full professorship is a long journey, often characterized by many developments, growth, maturity, insights, hopefully very few tribulations along the way, but probably a lot of learning that goes into the evening as the cumulative impact of a life spent in scholarship. And it's important that we recognize Prof. Maarman's family and friends and loved ones, because it's also thanks to the people who have supported him in his life's journey that we are able to celebrate with him this evening as academic community. We continue a long-standing tradition at UWC this evening, one that honors academic progress both for the individual and also for the institution. People often talk about an inaugural lecture as a rite of passage that signals a scholar's elevation to full professorship, which is, of course, the highest academic rank at the university. Sometimes when I think of rites of passage, I think about, initiations and all the complexities and ambivalences that go into those practices. But this evening, I think we are celebrating in the fullness of joy. And even though this is a rite of passage, Prof. Maarman, it is also, in essence, a celebratory moment. And although we talk about it as the culmination of many years of scholarly work, teaching, engagement, and institutional service, we also recognize that we are here celebrating the future. So in recognizing you this evening and being together this evening, we are also, in a sense, marking the promise of what is to come. The many generations of future postgraduate students, the many colleagues that you will continue to work with, a future that is not only bright in scholarly terms, but will have a long-lasting impact beyond this evening as you continue to grow in scholarship. It makes me think of one of the humbling observations that my own supervisor made to me many years ago when I was on the doctoral journey. And she said to me, remember that the completion of a doctorate is only the end of the formal qualifications you need in order to become a researcher. And similarly then, this rite of passage as full professor is really what we also think of as the beginning of the rest also of your scholarly life. So there's lots to look forward to in as much as we recognize the wonderful contributions you've made. Prof. Maarman's scholarship interrogates the intersection of poverty, schooling, and freedom. Drawing on the capability approach and theorists such as Amartya Sen and David Perkins, Professor Maarman challenges us to rethink the purpose and the value of the school curriculum, not only in terms of assessment and performance in assessment, but in terms of what enables young people to become. His inaugural lecture this evening is titled, appropriately, "We Can Dream: Freedoms and Life-worthiness of Basic Education in a Democratic South Africa." And that theme speaks directly to one of the most urgent questions of our time. How can basic education serve as a platform for real freedom in a very unequal society? This is not a theoretical question for us at UWC. It's not a theoretical question either in South Africa. It's one that speaks to the lived experience of millions of young people in our country, young people whose prospects for employment and therefore also dignity and meaningful participation in society and our democracy are shaped by the quality and the purpose of the education that they receive. Professor Maarman reminds us in his work that curriculum must do more than prepare learners for tests, it must also prepare them for life. As I draw towards my closing remarks, I want to add that UWC has long stood for equity, access, and a deep sense of responsibility to the public good. There are values in our history that continue to remain relevant to us even in the 21st century and which carry us forward as a university. These are not abstract values or principles, but commitments that we try to live out in our work through the scholars that we have among us, and notably through Professor Maarman's work with us, whose research challenges us to think critically, but also to act boldly, confronting the realities of education in South Africa today. Professor Maarman, this evening we celebrate you and we acknowledge the dedication and the depth that has brought you to this point. Congratulations on this well-deserved recognition. We look forward to your reflections this evening, and let me now invite the Dean of the Faculty of Education to formally introduce you to us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, academics, our students, and other invited guests. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a colleague that I know, and we share a lot of commonalities. As I was in the room, I was teasing Prof. Maarman. In the days of apartheid, I was teaching at Woolop Secondary in Malabar, and it was then that Prof. Maarman was a discipline learner at Galvindale Secondary School in 1986. After he completed his matric, he came to UWC and he pursued a BA degree, which he completed in 1992, and then went on to complete a higher degree in education in 1993, specializing in methods of geography and biblical studies. He then was successful in teaching at a school in Somerset East for 9 years. And then, whilst he was there, he pursued to complete a master's degree in education at the Rouaan Afrikaans University in 2001. And immediately after completing the degree, he then took up a post at the Northwest University as a lecturer. In 2005, he completed his PhD in comparative education at the Northwest University. Then in 2008, with me, he joined the University of Western Cape, the Faculty of Education. And by coincidence, we both, when we landed in Cape Town, we stayed at the same place. Knowing Prof. Maarman, he has made great contributions to the Faculty of Education in a number of ways, particularly in terms of Educational Studies Department. With all his achievements in 2017, he was promoted to an associate professor. And continuing in the great strides and ensuring that the faculty is on a growth path in terms of transforming the quality of education that we deliver to our students, in 2025, he was promoted to full professor. In the Faculty of Education, Prof. Maarman is highly engaged. He served initially as the program coordinator for the B.Ed undergraduate program, and then as head of Department of Educational Studies, and then now currently serving as the Deputy Dean Research for Postgraduate and Research. And under his leadership, colleagues, the faculty's research output and postgraduate supervision output has increased tremendously, and we gratefully appreciate that. He also serves in the Senate Higher Degrees Committee, and as the Rector indicated, that he widely publishes on poverty, schooling, and more importantly, the state of education in South Africa. He has engaged in a number of initiatives and publications in terms of supporting the Western Cape Education Department, as well as the National Planning Commission, where he has produced reports that have been very useful in terms of deriving some indicators of how to move forward with education in South Africa. On an international level, he has engaged in guest lectures with students from the Karlstad University in Sweden, the John Moores University in Liverpool, and also visiting students from the University of Missouri. Prof. Maarman, knowing him, is at no point in any way unapologetically when he speaks about the state of education in South Africa, both in the media and in engaging with other stakeholders in terms of the schooling sector. With that, I introduce Prof. Maarman and welcome him.
Good afternoon, everybody. I didn't expect such a big crowd, given the showers of blessings we had earlier, but I'm appreciative of the moment and your efforts to brace the inclement weather and spend some time with us. Rector, thank you for your welcome. I appreciate that. I still feel that we should welcome you at UWC when we have events, but I appreciate that. Prof. Governor, thank you for introducing me. And thank you for the colleagues who have attended. So the deans of the other faculties, I appreciate your time to share this moment with us. I must say that this lecture I have to dedicate to the special people. And the special people are those closest to me for my whole lifetime. And especially my own core family, my wife Yolanda and my 3 children, who keeps me the person I am. So thank you. It's Women's Month of August. So I want to add all the women of UWC as being part of this and my dedication to you and your efforts at UWC. We have brilliant female leaders at UWC. I had the privilege of serving under 2 DVCs for the last 10 years, 11 years. And I've learned a lot and I've grown a lot. So forever I'll be thankful for that. Somehow, colleagues, I have to find my presentation. My title has to do with basic education. So my obsession and preoccupation is schooling in South Africa, and especially in the democratic era. So I grew up in the colonial and apartheid period, and had to deal with the remnants of that in my young life. Currently, I feel that we should keep dreaming in a democratic South Africa. We should never stop dreaming. But more importantly for me, is that we should protect the dreams of our young people in our schools. And this is where I'm coming from with this title. Freedoms are subjective. And each one of us interpret our freedoms differently. But life-worthiness for school children is non-negotiable. In South African schools, we should ensure that our young people are exposed to an education that sets them up for a prosperous youth, prosperous early adulthood and a prosperous life. I want to touch on a few things: the colonial encounter as a dreamer, the affordances of my subject discipline, comparative education, to confront the neoliberal educational enterprise, the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen for interdisciplinary reasoning, and then I want to get to the thwarted promise of South African basic education and look at a few curriculum context dilemmas. And then I want to end off with lifeworthiness and educational agency. So it might sound a lot, but for me it's very clear. My schooling ensured at a young age that everything in education is connected. And whether I'm a language teacher, whether I'm a mathematics teacher, we share the same goals. Teaching at the university has opened up a world for me, and in particular, University of the Western Cape, where I was afforded opportunities to grow as a scholar and exposed to the best minds of our time. I see one sitting in the fifth row in the audience. So the colonial encounter as a dreamer. So for me, I was exposed to the remnants of this growing up as a young child, even before going to school. I was fortunate that my parents were teachers, I believe. So I was exposed to an intellectual conversation of what it means to have intergenerational remnants of a slave history, of intergenerational remnants of being exposed to the hard edge of apartheid South Africa, the intergenerational remnants of being exposed to a schooling of domination by others. I therefore relate my title further to the magical consciousness phase of Paulo Freire, where we all as youngsters are dreamers and in awe of the world. And we believe in the good of everybody. And as we grow older, we find that, well, there are actually a lot of evil people amongst us. And how are we now going to navigate that? That was my early life story. A point of interest here. In the middle, you see the book, The Super Afrikaners. So that's a book that chronicles how the Afrikaner Broederbond, since the early 1920s, impacted the political direction of South Africa, and therefore of education in South Africa. And something very interesting when I got to read this book, the real one, the one that you see there, I saw that at the back of the book was a list of all the signed up Broederbonders in South Africa at the time. And I counted them. It was like 12, 13 pages of them. And I found that my small town in rural Eastern Cape, Somerset East, is the fourth highest signatories to the Afrikaner Broederbond. It was Johannesburg first, then Pretoria, then Bloemfontein, and then Somerset East. And for me, that was a shocker. So if I get this back from the person I've borrowed it to, I'm going to make copies and distribute it on social media so that people can believe me. However, it shaped my early thinking of what education should be as a youngster. The schooling at the Cape, for me, was very interesting when I started to teach this at UWC many years ago. And to reflect upon what is the life-worthiness of schooling. So if we look at this, you will see certain very important things that relates to life-worthiness. Since the first official formalized schools in our country, the school curriculum was geared towards a purpose post-school. And the purpose was obviously the one that we know, the slave, colonial, and apartheid purpose. We all know that South Africa likes commissions. We have commissions of investigation weekly in our country. So many years ago, we had the first one in the official schooling system. And the findings were very important. Schooling was very poor, sporadic, fragmented, disorganized. The farmers at the time and the slave owners didn't want their children to attend school because they didn't have to. They are masters already. Education was regarded as a private matter, and children only needed to read the Bible. Were some of those findings. These findings are important because if we argue today about the class system in the South African society, many of these things are still true. The Great Education Act, I put that in inverted commas because it was not great. It was discriminatory. But it was based on class size or school size. But under this, the schools were already organized according to racial lines. So it was not a great education act. It was just a big education act. But it did bring forth the rapid growth in school enrollment, as we can see at the bottom. That's a lot of learners enrolled in school in a short span of years. But all of this played off the backdrop of a political system that was very sharp, with a sharp edge. If we look at this, this is what can happen in 5 years. The introduction of discriminatory laws against black South Africans to ensure that no freedoms are enhanced, to make sure that wherever you turn, there will be a law that manages you and guide you in the direction the masters decide where you should go. And this is just a snapshot of that 5-year period. Of course, before that 5 years period and after that, there was a lot of these. But I have to show that. The first Carnegie Commission in South Africa was focused on white schooling, white education in South Africa. And the findings brought the then apartheid government to intensify their oppressive agenda via education. The promotion of freedoms of white South Africans and the containment of freedoms of others. And then a few years later, we have the well-documented Iceland Commission on Black Education, and we all know what that led to. But one of the findings, the first one, education program was not part of the socio-economic development plan for black South Africans. Speaks to the life-worthiness of Bantu education that follows. Of course, if you have a particular philosophy of life, you have to afford your resources to that. And we had educational funding per learner in South Africa with a difference. And if we move on a few years later, it got worse. So this led to something very interesting in South Africa, and that was the creation of white universities to accommodate these successful products of the system into higher education. So it was the building of new universities as well as the expansion of existing white universities. I reflected upon this the other day and I thought, this is exactly where we are currently in South Africa, but in a different way. So if you look at these universities, so I had the privilege to visit some of them. Rand Afrikaans University, I hold a master's degree from them. I visited University of Pretoria, Nelson Mandela University, University of the Free State, I saw them all. Their expansion is still visible, physically, on those campuses of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It was just concrete blocks that were used to suddenly erect buildings to accommodate white successful children into the university life. Some of these remnants of an oppressive pedagogy in our schools and our political system led to very bad experiences, lived experiences for learners and teachers in our schools. There's a list of some, there are many others. Let me make an example of the sanitized educational approach of mining in South Africa. So my favorite subject in school was geography, and I studied mining in Standard 9 and Standard 10. And in the textbook, the geography textbook, around mining was just a good story. It was the story of how much mining contributed to the GDP of South Africa, how much gold afford the rest of the world, how much power the apartheid government could sway having all the minerals. So it was the good story. The story did not touch on the mine workers at all. The story did not touch on the rights of the mine workers' families. The story did not touch on the mine workers' conditions of work. The story did not touch on the mine workers' conditions when there are earthquakes in the Witwatersrand, now called Gauteng area. So we sit with these remnants in ourselves as school children of the 1980s. And we had to make sense of this. But we had to keep dreaming, because we had to fight this, and we are growing up. Very soon we're going to be adults, and we have to respond to this. One of the red highlights for me is the teacher-pupil ratio. And that was the one that sort of separated white academic performance and black academic performance in our schools. This colonial encounter, in my view, stayed with me. Many years later, I published this out of my PhD, and it had to do with the processing of demographics and the processing of numbers, in simple terms, in an education system. And surprise, surprise, beginning of this year, I was contacted to speak about this very old article that I forgot I published, because South Africa today struggles with the processing of numbers in the education system, in particular the schooling system, but also in the university system. So the colonial encounter for me is part of me. I can't get rid of it. However, I have to keep dreaming, and I have to respond in a certain way. In my subject discipline, the comparative education, we study education systems across the world. And we do it in different ways. And what you see there is a summary of the different phases of development of that discipline. My favorite will always stay phase 2, even if it was decades and maybe centuries ago. The systematic data collection for analyses. I will always do that as a comparativist, because I have to understand statistics. I have to understand the trends of where basic education is going and what is changing. But mostly we nowadays operate in phase 6 and phase 7 because we are now dealing with the complexity of life in the VUCA world. So I subscribe to the heterogeneity tradition in comparative education, where truth in human experience is recognized. I draw my inspiration from the works of the liberation heroes, in my view, the people who have dared to dream under difficult circumstances. So let's look at comparative education a little bit closer. In comparative education, we use the structure to look at the education system. And it is just the structure. And I'm sure that all the learned people in the room might disagree of how you should structure and organize the education system, and that is fine. So, the internal determinants, the historical forces that shapes an education system, what the history has brought for us, the reciprocal nature of the different components and elements that we see in front of us, and the educational nature is always there. That can't change. However, the external determinants is where we focus on nowadays more. So, the philosophy of life, how the political tradition and the political dominant party in a particular country would shape an education system, the politics of the day, practicing of politics, and in my case, socioeconomics. That is what I'm obsessed about. Poverty is important for me because poverty is part of me. Poverty is important for me because it is, according to me, one of the biggest indicators of academic success in schools. So if we look at the stats in South Africa, we are a poor nation. But if we look at the nutritional needs indicator, we are a very poor nation. And hence, we have to protect the dreams of our children. In basic education, we do not have a choice. We accept and we know in South Africa that it is highly racialized. And we also accept how the government look at poverty. However, in education, in comparative education, we look at poverty very differently. So for us, it's all about the human experience within these indicators. So we look at relative poverty and subjective poverty and how that changes. We accept that it is temporal and contextual, and it is time-bound. So if we look at the snapshot of social grants South Africa, and there's a reason I'm throwing certain stats out, we see that almost 20 million South Africans are on social grants in our country, also very highly racialized. We have different categories of these social grants, and we are adding more as time goes on. And then for me, there's, in terms of basic education, some indicators that tells us that things are not okay. That the life-worthiness of the whole basic education experience is questionable. And that our care for our youngsters within this system where we have that mandate to do is problematic. So yes, we are hungry and we are angry in South Africa. And I'm so fortunate to work at a university who doesn't run away from this reality. If you look at what happened, and this will be my last stats on poverty. If you look at what happened during the first year of the pandemic, in the red highlight, the increase in basic food over just a few months, over 6 months in South Africa. That is despite our poverty. And also we can argue that our poorest citizens in South Africa use these food groups to base their basic needs on. So let's go to Amartya Sen that I'm very passionate about. So he affords us with a different thinking about poverty. His economic philosophy revolves around the human condition, first and foremost, and not around welfarism or an economic system. He draws from economic philosophers like Karl Marx and builds his work on that of John Rawls. And John Rawls is an important figure. His reading, or his work in 1971, A Theory of Justice, is the one that really sparked a worldwide, a global debate on welfarism and also on economic philosophy. And he argues that the greatest equal liberty principle takes priority, followed by the equal opportunity principle, and finally the difference principle. Also meaning that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that it is the greatest benefit of the least advantaged in society. So if we use his thinking, we can argue that apartheid and colonial funding means that white South Africans at the time had 6 times more opportunities to pursue their real freedoms. And therefore, Amartya Sen had to respond. Amartya Sen, although building on the Rawlsian theory, raised concerns over Rawls's emphasis on primary social goods. And he argues in his work, Inequality Re-examined, that we should attend not only to distribution of primary goods, but on how effectively people are able to use those primary goods to pursue the goals they value, what's important for them, putting the human person in the center. He criticizes the contractarian tradition of poverty alleviation and social justice at the time, These are the 1970s and late 70s. He criticizes Rawls's overemphasis on institutions as guarantors of justice and the lack of emphasis on human behavior within those institutions to maintain, and I want to add, to promote a just society. So Amartya Sen therefore positioned himself squarely in the paradigms of rationalism and critical theory. Hence, me being a fan. So let's look at the capabilities approach shortly. It is a framework for assessing well-being and development by focusing on individuals' capabilities to achieve valuable beings and doings. It is very personalized and individual, emphasizing the freedoms and opportunities individuals have to live the lives they value. So it will differ from person to person, that's important. There's a recognition of individually valued opportunities and group valued opportunities. A recognition that needs, interests, and desires are temporal and contextual. So those are the intellectual tools, or some of the intellectual tools Amartya Sen put forward for us. And he uses this to argue about the transformation of societies. So we all have capabilities, our interests, our dispositions, our talents. We all have that. Every person has that. But there's a recognition that transformation should take place somewhere to translate those into achievements and into functionings. And Amartya Sen says there are capability sets to view and analyze this with. So certain capability sets like individually valued opportunities, spatial differences, systematic group contrast, and so forth. But what I do, or try to do, is to use effective reasoning in order to reason about what are the real freedoms that's afforded in a particular context. Use evaluative reasoning, which refers to the development of free agency. So real freedoms and free agency in basic education is what I investigate. So I want to get to the thwarted promise of South African basic education. And I'm not going to do an analysis of the CAPS curriculum, but I'm going to put the CAPS curriculum in a particular context and listen to the voices of the people. So for me, there's an overall letdown of the democratic basic education system. There's a disappointment. So we have on average, and these are average statistics, we have on average 1 million matriculants in the public system. 750,000 of them pass matric. The university, national university uptake is around 200,000, can be less, I think. The average TVET uptake is 240,000. So we still have an average of 560,000 young people on an annual basis completing matric who don't have a direction, an educational direction, a formal educational direction, or informal educational direction. And that presents us with a problem. I therefore question the life-worthiness of such a system. The other aspects relating to this thwarted promise is the racialized school performance in South Africa. None of us should be able to sleep at night that we still have this 30 years after democracy. The misalignment between basic education, higher education, and the economy. The two public schooling systems in one so-called democratic system. The lived experiences of learners and teachers. Curriculum strength. And of course, the life-worthiness of schooling. Just some statistics on the TVET sector, quickly. So in the second column, we see the total number registered for exams for those years. But in the red, the third column, highlighted in red, we see the number of students in the TVET sector completing their studies. It's around 20%. It's around 25%. If you look at the NVC level 4, of the third year, we see it's around 50% completions. So although we take up 240,000 TVET students on an annual basis in the TVET system, only a fraction of them complete within the time. Right? So it leaves us once again with the question of the life-worthiness of the system. In 2010, us in education would know this, but in 2010 we had this, a commission into school dropouts in South Africa. Once again, another commission. They found the prominent in-school factors is overcrowding, the culture of the teaching and learning in those schools, the lack of extramural stimulation. The out-of-school factors, they found poverty, which is my interest, poverty at home, poverty in my community, household dynamics, lack of parental supervision, transport to school. That's 15 years ago. Let's look at the 2020 case. We found the same trend still persisting. So by November 2020, we know this was the pandemic year, so we acknowledge that. Potentially 300,000 primary school learners dropped out over 6 months of schooling. And that is the Department of Basic Education's own statistics. A year later, still 650,000 school-going children out of the 13 million were not back in school. So we find that in South Africa, we drop out very quickly. And we drop out with big numbers out of the system. So that's a backdrop to that. Let's get closer to the class issue. And Amartya Sen is adamant on this. If we do not practice evaluative and effective reasoning, when we look at freedoms, understanding free agency and real freedoms of school learners, we will find ourselves doing weird things. So for example, in South Africa, we have these two systems. And these are not extreme cases, these are the norms, right? So let's look at school X. If you are high school and you have around 1,400 learners, the Department of Basic Education will afford you 41 teachers, right? So line number 1 is easy, it's fine. But look at line number 2. If you have money in South Africa, you can appoint your own teachers in that school. And we find that schools are allowed, and that they do, appoint up to 30% more teachers. That changes the lived experiences of learners and teachers in those schools. As a country, we have to decide, where do we want to go with this? Is this acceptable for a democratic country? It therefore play into all the other lines that you see. But an important one is line 6, where some young people in South Africa have the opportunity and the privilege to choose between 14 subject combinations in high school, and others don't. And the others, the school-wise, are the 85% of young people in South Africa. We are not promoting their freedoms. Let's look at what some of the teachers are saying. The teachers are saying that they are subject to a bureaucratic testing regime in our primary and high schools, meaning that they have to survive in these schools and they revert to teaching to the test, more than teaching to learn. And we know at university that teaching to learn is the way to go. That's what we do. But unfortunately, it's not the case in basic education. It raises the question again, the life-worthiness of the schooling system altogether. But nonetheless, the teachers have adapted to that. However, I find it strange that there are not more voices rejecting this outright, because that is what should happen. Let's go to curriculum strength. So I had the privilege at UWC to teach method of social sciences some years ago. And what I did in my very first lecture, when I meet the students, and these are third-year students coming out of the arts faculty, Geography 1, Geography 2, now they come to us, and they do the method of geography. So that very first lecture, when I meet them, I give them a grade 6 map work test, a standard 4 map work test. What's the name of this ocean? What's the name of this continent? What's the name of this river? What's the largest river in Africa? What's the longest river in South America? It's grade 4 work. And I give them this test every year. I gave them this test every year because I know this is going to happen. They're going to fail it dismally. These were my own students, which I loved very much. But I had to do this to them when they enter my classroom. But what is interesting to note is that these students, they came from different urban and rural schools, different provinces, different quintiles, up to quintile 5 schools. They were male and female students. So they were thus a representative sample of the grade 1s of 1995 to 2005 of that decade. So how is it that they are struggling with this? So then we would go ahead in class and we would problematize this. What might be the reasons for the dismal state of affairs? Because I was arguing with them, how can I remember my grade 6 map work of 35 years ago, 40 years ago, and you can't remember it, and you were just in grade 6 8 years ago? So, was it the teachers who taught them at that level? Were the teachers the problem? Was it the culture of learning in their schools? Was it the heads of departments of geography in the schools? Were it the school principals' leadership in those schools? What is the background of the learners? Is that the reason? What is the curriculum or the textbook, the geography textbook nowadays? What is the overall CAPS curriculum? Were there problems there? Because it didn't make sense how they performed in a grade 4 map work test, class test. And then I put the question to them and I gave them space to argue around this. And surprise, surprise, some of them would say that yes, your education were better at school in the 1980s than ours in the democratic era. But it was them saying it, not me. But I wanted to show this example because it's a real example that happened in our classrooms here at UWC. And it's an example that speaks to curriculum strength of the current school curriculum. Then with some of my other classes, I would do the same. I would say, reflect on your teaching practice and choose a topic to do a research proposal on in your final year, in your 4th year before you go to school. And all of them were running to one problem. The learners cannot read in the schools. It was given only based on their teaching practice experience, which was limited, but nonetheless, all these learners over all these years felt the same thing. And they argued that within that lies the solution to everything. If the learners could read, then they would be able to learn better. We posed the same questions to them, just to stimulate the intellectual conversation in class, or in our lecture halls. At the bottom, I would ask them, is it just the teachers who do not read with the learners every day, that they are supposed to? Because they gave 2 language periods a day. It's 10 a week, 10 hours a week. Is that maybe the issue? So yes, I had to go out and find out from the teachers themselves. And I have to represent their voices. Their voices matters to me. I'm applying effective reasoning in terms of our free agency developed amongst learners on how to read, how to develop reading and learning in schools, and also evaluative reasoning, right? Is the reading curriculum taking them to real freedoms, to be able to read freely? And the teachers said, well, we have this problem, we have a dilemma in front of us. It's not so easy, not so simple. Because the CAPS curriculum asks from us the following. With 10-year-olds, in a 2-week cycle, we have to focus on listening and speaking, reading and comprehension, writing exercise, and language structures. But we have to add synonyms and antonyms, punctuation, question marks, exclamation marks, inverted commas, and so on. Spelling, indirect and direct speech. I was surprised when I heard that. Adverbs, idioms, cardinal words, ordinal words, all in the 2-week cycle with our 10-year-olds. And I said, okay, maybe it's good language teachers will be able to do that. And they said, okay, come and try doing that and being successful. So the teachers themselves say that the sequencing of language topics in the curriculum is limiting the ability to read and to develop language skills. They prefer something else. But then they add that we are teaching this in large classes, very large classes, from the foundation phase onwards. And therefore, we have to resort to teaching to the test, to be safe and not to be labeled. And we sit with a progression policy, even in primary school, that states that you can only fail once in a phase, and then you have to be promoted to the next grade. And then it's expected from us to attend all these meetings on a monthly basis. Let's pause that and let's go further. What are the teachers saying about classroom factors limiting their freedoms? Applying this reasoning in my work has to do with looking at the real freedoms, going deep into the conversation to understand what is really happening in a school classroom. So the teachers are saying, caps are too bulky, the time limitations is straddling us, we teach in over-resourced classrooms, and we have a lack of resources to teach in our schools. So what are the implications of this? How do we overcome the resource challenge? Why are we accepting overcrowded classrooms in our public schools? Because the annual national assessment results revealed classroom size as the first determinant in academic performance in this province's schools. The first one. So when they presented it us to our faculty, when they invited us to the DBE, to the WCD, to share the information and the analysis of these statistics, of the test results, they themselves said classroom size is the first determinant. Just look at another example. We asked the teachers what are the school factors limiting their freedoms to teach what they value. And they said unnecessary interruptions, 30% of the time. 30% of my time teaching, that's interrupted unnecessarily. Too many meetings, 30% of my time going to teach as a teacher, which is my mandate. I want to highlight the voice of a very young teacher that we interviewed. The teacher said, I'm already qualified at university. My head of department is enough to support me doing my work. I do not need the deputy principal, the principal, and the subject advisor to show me how to do my work. That is 3 reporting lines too many, taking me away from my teaching, what I was supposed to do. Let's look at what the teachers say are the out-of-school factors limiting their freedoms to teach what they value. And these we know because we know our country. So we accept poverty as our reality, but we should not contribute to poverty creation of the youth. We teach about substance abuse and literacy in schools, but we don't teach about poverty in schools. We don't teach about crime in schools. We don't teach about parental involvement in schools. We have to ask the questions, what should be included in the school curriculum to enhance its life-worthiness in this context that we live, in our reality? Therefore, we wanted to respond somehow and we made certain attempts. And yes, the uptake was very well, I must say. Whatever we said in our faculty about our views on the real freedoms in the basic education sector was taken up well by South Africans. So it is topical, is something that people want to engage with. We have put out these 10 PhDs under my supervision, using the capabilities approach to look at the real freedoms of learners and teachers in the basic education sector. These are not the titles, these are the issues that came out of it. So the pro-poor policies, that is where you start. We start with policy. You would remember the first column on the structure earlier. We problematized the progression policy in schools. We looked into the gender and inclusive policies of our neighboring country, how Marxism can shape higher education, the nexus of the school leadership and teaching to learn, the National Development Plan and its relevance for curriculum improvements in our schools, the nature of support at TVET students, the models of mentorship for beginner teachers, the voices of teachers in the quality education discourse, the freedom of teachers to teach what they value. We are proud of that work because it has been produced in our communities, in poor communities, in quintile 1 and 2 schools. It has been produced with the teachers of those schools and the parents of those schools. So I regard this publication as a seminal work. Post-PhD, I had to decide, what do I want to do with my life? And I decided I'm going straight into the informal settlement where I belong and look at their schooling experience, talk to their teachers, and after that I've decided that this is the time where we have to create a voice for the learners in informal settlement schools in South Africa. Yes, it was a particular contextual area, but it had to deal with getting out what we are experiencing and nobody's talking about it. We further engaged the National Planning Commission, and we did a survey in the Western Cape province with the grade 12s and just asked them a simple question. Do you know that whether South Africa has a national development plan? And there you can see the results. Only 6% at the time were aware that their country had a national development plan. And they are standing on the verge of young adulthood. They are leaving school. But they had no clue that it existed. So we engaged the National Planning Commission on that, and we publicized it widely. Then COVID happened. And since then, we haven't received anything in terms of growth, except that we know there are new commissioners, and the NDP is now reviewed. But it raises the question, what are our learners learning in the schools? What is the curriculum affording them to create and to think about their futures? If we look at the general aims of the CAPS, we find that it is noble. We find that it is forward-thinking. We found that it is liberal in nature. It is really, if you read it, it is really something that we can aspire to and what we should do. However, there are some questions about this CAPS curriculum if we apply Amartya Sen's reasoning. So far, it has produced racialized school performances. Suddenly, we are faced with this contrast. On the one hand, these general aims are directing our curriculum. On the other hand, it produces racialized school performances. It is practiced in a rich-poor school environment, which goes against the underlying philosophy of the general aims. It is practiced in overcrowded classrooms. It is practiced in an illogically sequenced layout of a teaching plan, especially in languages and in mathematics, in primary schools. A mark adjustment practice is applied to satisfy target setting policies of these aims. There are clear curriculum strength challenges that we are all aware of. It is practiced in a discriminatory language of teaching and learning policy because in South Africa, we expect 85% of our 9-year-olds to switch to a foreign language in a year's time. It is practiced within an overbearing testing regime. It is practiced in a teaching to test methodology, mainly. It is practiced in an over-bureaucratic system of compliance. So as South Africans, we have to make sense of this. We have the aims written up in the curriculum, but we have these outcomes for the majority of young people in our country. So how are our learners and teachers supposed to pursue the growth of their freedoms in such a curriculum space? Because this is the real curriculum space, not the one written on paper. So let me take you to my final thoughts. I thus argue that the very aims of the CAPS are undermined by a political position that does not acknowledge and promote real freedoms in the very system that should promote it. That is where our young people should learn about their freedoms. That is where they should develop the confidence to build their own freedom space. That is where they should generate free agency. I'm of the considered view that epistemological access is hampered and that epistemic violence reigns in our poor school communities. I argue that there is an educational quietude in terms of the impact of learners' backgrounds on their academic growth in our schools. I argue that the CAPS has been handed over to bureaucrats to keep order over our schooling experience and not to enhance real freedoms of our children. Classrooms should be places of courageous intellectual encounters for all, not only the privileged few. In the words of Amartya Sen, we are thus still stuck in a pseudo-transformation phase to realize the dreams of all our children, not only the privileged few. I therefore believe that comparative education provides the intellectual tools to confront neoliberal constructions in education, and that Amartya Sen helps us to reason deeply about real freedoms so that we in education can continue to protect and promote the dreams of our children in the wishes of a Karl Marx, Frantz Fanon, Mangaliso Sobukwe, Paulo Freire, and Steve Biko. Those were the dreamers before us. I want to stay dreaming with them. In his memoirs, Amartya Sen wrote this. When he was 18 years old, he diagnosed his own cancer. 18 years old. Not long after he had moved to Calcutta for college, he noticed a lump growing inside his mouth. He consulted 2 doctors, but they laughed away his suspicions. So Sen, then a student of economics and mathematics, looked up a couple of books on cancer from a medical library. He identified the tumor, a squamous cell carcinoma. And later, when a biopsy confirmed his verdict, he wondered if there were, in effect, 2 people within his name. A patient who had just been told he had cancer, but also the agent responsible for the diagnosis. I must not let the agent in me go away, Sen decided, and absolutely could not let the patient take over completely. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Maarman, for a very inspiring presentation. I now hand over to Prof. Rajendran Chetty for as a respondent.
Good evening, colleagues, students, distinguished guests. I'm delighted to present this response to Professor Maarman's inaugural address. I will use large brush strokes to focus on a few critical elements, mainly the dysfunctional school system, the curriculum, and social inequality. From the perspective of ethical commitment to equality for all children, each one of us should be concerned with the current condition of the public education system. Quality schooling is essential for social transformation. More importantly, it takes political courage and radical intellectualism to contest inequality. The schooling crisis has reached endemic proportions, and our silence may give consent for injustice against children. The failure to meaningfully transform a dysfunctional schooling system, despite significant public expenditure, is a quiet crisis and disaster of the democratic era. South Africa remains at the bottom of all international tables on learning outcomes, science, maths, reading. As a result, the majority of poor, mainly black children, still do not receive the education they need to escape poverty. The Department of Basic Education is aware that it is dysfunctional, and there seems to be no will to change. The Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation's 2018 review reveals that the DBE is not fully compliant in 3 major areas: human resources and systems management, governance and accountability, and financial management. The performance over the past 5 years since the review has deteriorated. The result is that schools are seemingly compliant with formal processes, but in practice is locked into a low-level equilibrium of mediocrity. One way that the Education Department tried to deliver better learning outcomes is through the curriculum reform. The curriculum and assessment policy that you heard in the lecture was a pragmatic initiative to provide structure to subject content, objectives, and assessments, and as the department claims, reduces teachers' administrative loads. The latter is untrue. As research at UWC in 2019 revealed, that teachers spend more time with assessments and administrative work and less in teaching. Interestingly, the DBE has admitted that despite these curriculum reforms, school performance has not reached expected levels. Reformers often fail because the temptation is to avoid the tough actions needed for extensive change, and thus do something, anything, even if it has little chance of making a marginal impact. This is why we often see a focus on simply adding inputs like textbooks, tablets, and teacher salary increases, and sometimes more buildings. The critical question: should we see education reform as a series of narrow, isolated interventions that produce marginal improvements in a generally dysfunctional system? Or do we tackle the underlying challenges in a sustained and coordinated manner for substantive improvement? We too should take responsibility for this failure. Teacher education has not made a stronger case for fundamental reform to improve the quality of learning in classrooms. Universities' allegiance to the state is a key reason for our silence. The state is not committed to education reform as a priority. The one system fits all does not work in a country that is a world apart, characterized by 2 parallel societies, and it is the well-resourced, advantaged schools that we romanticize and use in teacher education as our yardstick. The other school system, located in townships and ghettos, that we rarely see, enrolls a vast majority of poor and working-class children, whose health, economic, and community difficulties, concomitant with equally deficit schools, produce learners that read at the functional level, write without fluency, and use inappropriate concrete techniques with maths. Given this world apart, it is intriguing that the Western Cape Education Department continues to ignore the need for what I call a bimodal distribution of achievement scores and settles for the misleading measure of central tendency. The Western Cape still conducts evaluations in grade 3, 6, and 9, but they only provide aggregated data. This is a deliberate attempt to obscure the underlying unequal achievement based on race. In the context of substantial inequality, it is vital that the true picture of underachievement is portrayed. When the literacy achievement scores in grade 6 were disaggregated in the Western Cape by us, 4 out of 5 children in the former white schools were reading at grade level, while in black schools, only 4 children in 100 were reading at grade level. What then, colleagues, is the litmus test of a successful education system? The structural conditions of disadvantaged schools provokes a sense of anger among young people. It's a case of relative deprivation, a substantial discrepancy between the rhetoric that the doors of learning shall be open to all and what they actually receive, what they don't have and others have. It should therefore come as no surprise that the majority of Black, African, and colored youth are uneducated, unemployed, and unemployable. Not every child gets a fair chance to complete their education. 40% of learners who start grade 1 drop out before completing matric. This has long-term consequences for economic and social development. Youth unemployment stands equally at 40%, primarily due to a lack of educational achievement. The state's mantra of "no one left behind" is false rhetoric, as the planning, policy, and decision-making has for over 3 decades been unsuccessful. A routine task like the feeding scheme could not be operationalized in some provinces, and children were denied of their only meal for over 4 months, evidence of a state that does not care. Poor infrastructure, school violence, and other social ills are important concerns. However, the focus has detracted from the central objective of improving learning that takes place in classrooms. This is the critical performance requirement for the department and the country. Improving education quality would enhance job prospects and income for people in poor areas. Seen in this way, education can help to address systemic barriers that contribute to poverty, such as lack of access to health care, food insecurity, and gender inequality. Key problems include weak teacher knowledge and unmotivated teachers, a lack of accountability throughout the system, and a captured education bureaucracy with insufficient competence. These 3 obstacles to progress can be solved if they are tackled with appropriate measures. Sadly, it is the resistance movements like equal education that are taking on the tough issues, such as the dysfunctional condition of the education bureaucracy, not universities. It was equal education that revealed that 267 Western Cape schools do not have functional toilets. There is no education system that can be better than the quality of its teachers. Students seeking to become primary school teachers, the most critical schooling phase, are weaker than all their other peers, entering universities with only a shaky grasp of language and mathematics fundamentals. astonishingly, university programs across the country still do very little to ensure the teachers they certify can teach reading and mathematics effectively. Scholarship underpinned by epistemic responsibility is central to the post-colonial dilemma of educational development. We should lean on the emancipatory lens of revolutionary humanism espoused by critical race theorists that position the role of the scholar inside the struggle of people. It will enhance our engagement with the children we research and why the counter-narrative, the voice of the marginalized other, is essential to educational research. The People's Education Movement of the 1980s, based on the Freedom Charter, embedded Paulo Freire's critical thinking perspectives, which we seem to have abandoned. It is worrying to note that CAPS advocates the principles of social transformation, but fails to enact them. CAPS encourages an active approach to learning rather than banking education. But despite these promises, retrograde impulses are drawing national education back towards a pre-1994 program of memorization and a shift from meaning construction to content-driven learning. Critical educational studies is essential for the recovery of South Africa's intellectual landscape. We should recommit to a cognitive approach as it is conducive to the development of rational young citizens. Priorities should shift from learning to thinking, and this requires a redefinition of the function of the classroom. How do we succeed in presenting knowledge as a potentially emancipatory force in learners' lives, so that when learners leave schools with minds of their own and a critical awareness that would generate social change? When we develop in learners some of the expertise necessary for decoding structures of signification, we equip them intellectually to read our own practices, our institutions, and the world as a text. The deepening divide based on race and class and the abdication of the state to address the fundamentals of public education is a moral issue, not an economic issue. How can teachers who may themselves have been taught in systems that reinforce inequality disrupt the discourse that blames children for low achievement? Did 3 decades of educational transformation with 4 major curriculum changes simply mean changing the positionalities of actors in the power relations, mostly patriarchal Afrikaner nationalists to patriarchal African nationalists? Neville Alexander cautioned us that the end of apartheid would not bring about the end of class exploitation. And we see this clearly in the 2 different worlds of schooling. Democracy has not resulted in creating the conditions in which agency and voice can emerge. Those on the margins remain unheard. We witness the violence of monolingualism and the underachievement of poor children, how it disempowers children who do not speak school languages, the struggle of speaking against the home language, against the ruptured and broken speech of dispossessed and displaced children. Surely we should all be concerned about the dangers of low levels of literacy among such a large portion of the populace. What is certain is that in our profoundly anti-intellectual culture, inspiration rarely comes from schools. What is equally sure is that without an articulate left, the powerless will remain at the mercy of the system. Kudos to UWC for reviving the radical imperative for a university on the left. It's heartening that our long period of appeasement politics with the state is being disrupted. We must actively intervene in educational injustice, Nobody should live happily in the face of inequality. Nothing is beyond our grasp. We have agency, and we should stop being neutral. To conclude, the issue of educational inequality based on socioeconomic disadvantage, I repeat, is a moral issue. The continued inequality of schooling is a creation of society that violates the most basic precepts of a democracy. Such low educational achievement among such a large portion of the populace leads to high social costs in the form of unemployed and disengaged youth, higher costs of criminal justice and social grants. As the state increasingly finances its prisons and military and struggle to address crime-infested subaltern spaces, the born-frees are reading these as public betrayal. They are being forced to learn in context of humiliation, hunger, and disrespect. Children's life-worthiness is affected. They are not learning, growing, and striving to become the best version of themselves. Dysfunctional schools and a retrogressive curriculum are not simply reproducing inequality. They educate children away from academic mastery towards ignorance and social alienation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can give Prof. Chetty another round of applause for his response. Thank you very much. Our next item is the congratulatory word, which would be presented by Prof. Khalakhala. Following the congratulatory word, Prof. Khalakhala will be handing over the inaugural letter and the gift over here to Prof. Maarman. So thank you, Prof. Khalakhala.
Thank you, Prof. Lekay. An English statement, well, all the way from India, by the name of Nehru, once said, "What we really are matters more than what other people think of us." So, Prof. Maarman, what you really are matters more than what other people think of you. Congratulations for delivering such a wonderful inaugural lecture. It is a milestone, I want to believe, and as the Vice-chancellor pointed out earlier, I mean, for this lecture, in other words, it has confirmed that you have now gone through the rite of passage, and for that, you've now become a university academic of the highest rank. So well done to you, and we wish to congratulate you, your family, your faculty, and everybody that has supported you to become what you have become today. Thank you, colleagues. I have been given clear instructions by the faculty manager that I must manage this in 60 seconds. So as a law-abiding citizen, I'm doing just that. So please approach so that we can hand over your gifts.
Yes, another hand of applause. Thank you. Once again, congratulations, Prof. Maarman. So now it's time for the vote of thanks, and I will be delivering the vote of thanks. We would like to thank our esteemed colleague, Prof. Maarman. It is a great honor and privilege to propose this vote of thanks on this very memorable occasion. The work of Prof. Maarman has shown his very large footprint in the area of scholarship, both nationally and internationally. This leadership has spearheaded his host department, and I must just say Prof. Maarman comes from the Educational Studies department, where we tend to produce quite a bit of leaders in our department. So he comes from our Educational Studies department, and spearheaded his education very relevant to the faculty, and his role as Deputy Dean Research has amplified the structures. Today, from our inaugural lecture, it is evident that his research, it transcends more than just his scholarly work, but Prof. Maarman plays a very important role in inspiring his students, both his undergraduate and postgraduate student. He, as one can see from today, how many students have attended his inaugural lecture and how many students have supported him. So it's very important for Prof. Maarman to ensure that his work goes into the space where it can actually help students both at schools and university. So we congratulate you, Prof. Maarman. To all of you attending, we extend a very heartfelt gratitude to each of you for making this memorable occasion. Your presence, enthusiasm, and support of Prof. Maarman and the faculty have been truly inspiring. Together we have created a memorable occasion in Prof. Maarman's scholarly journey. Something wonderful for him, for his family, and thank you for his family and friends who have attended, and his children as well, because they were very excited. I spoke to them earlier today. To our those on the program, the national anthem sung by the Creative Arts Choir. Prof. Balfour did the welcome. The introduction of the inaugural lecture by Prof. Govender. The respondent, Prof. Chetty, and the congratulatory word by Prof. Khalakhala. Thank you very much. To the deans, the deputy deans, and the HODs who have shown support for Prof. Maarman by attending, and for those who are online, we thank you for your presence in this very auspicious occasion. We also would like to thank our administrators, and I know particularly Ms. Verleen Bierwinkel. She has played an instrumental role in making this very successful occasion take place, and also Ms. Kim Steyer and their team. I would also like to thank Mr. Hardy Zacharias and his team. Thank you for coming and for also making this such an auspicious occasion. I know we've had many, many meetings. I've seen you in our faculty quite often. And everybody who has come to this occasion, we thank you very, very much. And as we end, I would just like to end with a little quote. Coming together is a beginning, and keeping together is progress. Working together is success. And in our faculty and in the university, through Prof. Maarman's inauguration into the professorship, we tend to continue working in education. As you have noted from both his presentation and from the response, it seems as if, particularly in the education faculty, that we have a lot of work to do in our space. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Just before you clap, I would just like to say that as we leave Can you please ensure that the procession goes first? And following the procession, we will go up to the top for a photo session first with Prof. Maarman, family, friends, and all other academics. And following that, we will then go to refreshments. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. So we'll start with the procession.